Overnight, moss grew on the dead rock, and salt settled in the basin, piling up as high as a whole boat in the harbor. He didn't plant anything. He didn't sow anything. He simply sketched out a diagram with a shard of stone and spoke each corner aloud. And the stone obeyed him. But let's go back 3 days. Cold water splashes his face, and Daniel Hay opens his eyes. He's standing knee-deep in salt water in the middle of nowhere. Nothing but the ocean around him. Gray, empty, and straight out of the fog rises a black rock. A bare basalt spire. Not a blade of grass, not a speck of green, not a sign of life. In his right hand, a wet scrap of parchment. The letters are written in a language he has never seen, but he understands every word. A deed to the island. His island. He reads it twice, looks at the rock, back at the paper, and says aloud what any normal person would say, that this is the worst property of his entire career, and that they could at least have left some coffee on the shore. No one answers. Only the wind whistles between the rocks. Daniel wrings out his jacket and wades toward the rock. His feet sink into the rocky bottom. The water is freezing, but he keeps going, because in 10 years as a landscape architect, he's learned one thing. They gave him the land. First, stand on it, then figure it out. He makes his way to shore. The stone beneath his feet is warm and porous. He runs his hand over the surface. Basalt. Good thermal capacity. Break up the top layer, add organic matter, and in a season, the first grass will sprout. He's already calculating the slope when a sound rings out in his skull. Not a voice, more like a vibration, as if someone had struck a tuning fork inside his head. Owner registration complete. System requires a concept. Daniel freezes, sits down on a rock, looks at his hands. Ordinary hands. Calluses. Dirt under his nails. The hands of a man who has been digging in the ground for 10 years. He doesn't scream. He doesn't panic. Instead, he does what he always does at a new site. He talks to the earth. He says it's okay. Let's get acquainted. Show me what you've got. And he'll show how he can help. The system is silent, but something in the rock trembles slightly, as if the island has heard him. And this is where the strangest part begins. He spends his first night in a niche beneath an overhanging rock, without food, without tools, without communication. Without a single soul for hundreds of miles, his hands begin to tremble, not from the cold. Stars appear overhead. Alien, not a single familiar constellation. This isn't his world, not his sky. He pulls his knees to his chest and falls asleep. And the rock beneath him is warm, strangely warm for the night. Basalt doesn't work that way. But he doesn't care. The island keeps him warm all night. In the morning, he goes down to the eastern spring where water seeps from a crack, salty, mineral-rich, undrinkable, but water. And where there is water, there is life. You just need to know how to channel it. And he knows. For 2 hours he picks at the rock, tastes the stones, watches the shadow fall. Then he sits down and sketches with a stone fragment right on the basalt slab. A cascading desalination system. He used to build these in the salt flats of Utah. 8 basins, 3 levels. Salt water flows down a series of stone basins. The sun heats it. The water evaporates. The vapor condenses on the cold walls. Clean water collects at the bottom. He says each element aloud. 3-degree slope to the south. Rock type for the walls. Wind direction. Expected output about 2 liters per day. He utters the last word and freezes. 1 second. 2. 3, and the stone beneath the sketch begins to change. The lines he's scratched out grow deeper, sharper, as if someone had run a chisel over his sketch. Daniel watches, holding his breath. Then he gets up and hauls stones. He arranges them in the right order, and the stones fit easily, as if they have grooves he can't see but feels with his fingers. By evening, the cascade is ready, rough but functional. He falls asleep right there, and in the morning, he sees that the cascade has become overgrown. Overnight, moss has appeared on the stones, greenish, silvery. It works like a condenser. It increases the evaporation area tenfold. Water stands in the lower basin, transparent, clear. He scoops it up with his palm. The water isn't just fresh, it's sweet, like from a mountain stream. He drinks 3 handfuls and laughs, for the first time in 2 days. Because salt has settled in the upper basin, white, coarse, with a bluish tint. He licks a crystal. The taste is pure and crisp. He's seen salt like this once before, at an expensive restaurant in Portland. There, it cost a fortune. And here it formed overnight, a byproduct of his system. And then he understands the rules. The system didn't do anything for him. He designed the cascade himself, calculated the angles himself. He laid the stones himself. The system only sped things up, turned weeks into hours, years into days. But the foundation is his knowledge, his hands. The next week flies by in work. 3 cascades, 10 liters of water a day, a handful of bluish salt the size of 2 fists, and the first path from the niche to the cascades. He didn't just trample it out, he designed it. He spoke each turn aloud. And the stones settled more evenly, the cracks filled in, the surface became smooth. On the 8th day, fog rolls in, thick and heavy. Daniel is shaping the stones when he hears the creak of wood and the splash of oars. The bow of a schooner emerges from the mist, tattered sails, peeling paint. A short, broad-shouldered man jumps aboard, his eyes those of someone who hasn't slept in 3 days. He speaks a foreign language, but the words don't enter his head through his ears. They've gotten lost in the fog. They're out of water. 2 are sick. They need a place to stay, at least for the night. Daniel looks at the waterfall behind him. 10 liters a day. Enough for 1 person, with a little to spare. Barely enough for 6. And inside, 2 voices clash. The first one screams that this is his island, his water, his only resource, that he himself is barely surviving here. The second is silent. It simply shows the weary, desperate, living face of a man on the shore. Daniel sighs. He points to the waterfall and tells them to bring their water bags. The captain's name is Wren. He drinks from his palm, long and greedily. Then he freezes. He asks where the water is coming from. This is Bone Needle, after all, a dead rock. There's never been water here. Daniel shrugs. He built a desalinator. Wren looks at the cascade, at the moss, at the bluish crystals. He walks over, picks one up, puts it on his tongue, and stops breathing. He says it's moon salt, that it's mined on only 1 island in the entire archipelago, that a handful of it at the port gets you a silver coin, and that the handful lying by the shore can buy you a boat. Daniel sits down on a rock, looks at his waterfalls. Yesterday he was homeless on a rock. Today, he's homeless on a rock with a profitable business. He asks Wren if he knows where to buy seeds, and from that question begins the story of how a dead rock that nobody wanted becomes a place over which 4 empires will soon clash. Wren left and the island grew quiet again. Daniel stood by the cascade and counted his resources. A sack of grain, a coil of rope, lights, 10 liters of water a day, and a handful of salt that grew every day. Not much, but more than a week ago. A week ago, he had nothing. He lit his first fire in a niche under a rock. The dry seaweed he'd gathered on the shore gave off a faint, smoky flame. He soaked the grain in fresh water and ate it raw. The taste was disgusting. But calories are calories. Daniel chewed and thought. He needed soil, not rock. Soil. Soil in which he could grow food. And he had a plan. The southern slope. That very gentle, sheltered patch with ancient organic matter beneath the surface. If he could break up the top layer of basalt and mix it with what lay beneath, if he added the ground seaweed as fertilizer, if he channeled water from the cascade through a system of gutters, then maybe. He stood up and headed for the southern slope. The morning was just beginning. There was a full day's work ahead. He worked with his bare hands. He had to pry the stones out with his fingers. His fingernails broke off within the first hour. The skin on his palms was rubbed down to the flesh. Daniel wrapped his hands in strips of fabric torn from the hem of his shirt and continued. He couldn't design what he didn't understand, and to understand the south slope, he needed to reach that layer below. Dig. With his bare hands. No shovel, no pickaxe, nothing. By noon, he had dug out an area the size of a dining table. He piled the rocks along the edges. Beneath the basalt layer lay exactly what he had sensed through the system. Dark, loose rock. Almost soil, with flecks of something whitish. Maybe old coral. Maybe shell fragments. Organic matter. Ancient, but organic. Daniel took a handful and rubbed it between his fingers. He sniffed it. He licked it. Slightly acidic, low in nitrogen. But the structure is good, if enriched. If algae are added for nitrogen and ground seashells for calcium, if watering is provided, then it's possible to grow here. He sat down at the edge of his small plot and recited the specifications aloud. First terrace. Area 4 by 3 meters. Depth of the fertile layer is 30 centimeters. Composition: local weathered basalt. Ground algae. Seashells ground into grit. Drainage through a porous bottom layer. Drip irrigation from a gutter connected to the third cascade. The surface slopes 2 degrees southward for excess moisture runoff. Wind protection from the sea via a half-meter-high stone retaining wall. He spoke slowly and clearly, as if dictating technical specifications, because that's exactly what it was. The system was listening. He could feel it, that faint hum in his head, like a tuning fork attuned to his thoughts. The next 3 days were hell. Daniel hauled seaweed from the shore. He collected shells. He smashed stones against stones to get gravel. His hands ached so much that he woke up at night from the throbbing pain in his fingers. His back wouldn't straighten. His knees were scraped raw. He worked from dawn to dusk. He ate soaked grain. He drank water from the cascade. He slept in his niche, and he worked again. The system did nothing for him. The stones didn't move on their own. The seaweed didn't pile itself up. But he noticed. When he spread the shell grit into the soil, it settled out a little more evenly than it should have. When he ran the channel from the waterfall, the water found its way a little faster than his calculations predicted. Little things. But the little things added up to a miracle. By the end of the 3rd day, the first terrace was ready. 4 by 3 meters of dark, moist soil. With working drainage, with drip irrigation, with a stone windbreak. Daniel stood above it and couldn't believe he had done it. Alone, with his own hands, on bare rock. Then he thought that a crew of 12 people wouldn't hurt right now, and a bulldozer, and a coffee machine. But there was no crew. There was him, and his island. That was enough for now. Wren returned 16 days later, not in 2 weeks as he'd promised. Daniel had already started counting the days. On the 14th day, he caught himself looking at the horizon every hour. On the 15th, every half hour. On the 16th, he saw a sail at dawn and felt such relief that his legs buckled. Wren came ashore with 2 heavy sacks. The first one contained seeds. Daniel didn't know exactly what kind, local crops. Wren explained that it was ro chai, a fast-growing green, easy to grow, yields its first harvest in 3 weeks, and a root vegetable that Wren called by a word similar to duro. It grows more slowly, but keeps for months. The second sack contained tools, a knife, a hatchet, a small shovel with a short handle, a coil of wire, a piece of canvas. For Daniel, it was like Christmas. He held the shovel in his hands and stroked the handle. Wren looked at him as if he were crazy. Then Wren saw the terrace. He stood in front of it in silence. Then he walked around it. He touched the soil. He tasted the water from the gutter. He looked at Daniel. He said that 2 weeks ago there had been nothing but bare rock here. Daniel said 16 days. Wren didn't laugh. He realized this wasn't a joke. He asked how. Daniel thought for a second. Then he said he was a good specialist. That was true, just not the whole truth. The seeds went into the ground that same day. Daniel planted them almost tenderly, each seed in its own hole, at the right depth, at the right distance. He recited the parameters aloud out of habit. Ro chai, planting depth 1.5 centimeters. Spacing between seeds 10 centimeters. Watering daily 200 milliliters per square meter. Temperature conditions. He faltered. He had no idea what temperature conditions the local plants needed. He had never seen them. Wren, who was watching the process, said that ro chai grows anywhere, even on a rock, even on a deck. Daniel nodded. But he did it his own way anyway. He mulched the surface with chopped seaweed. He checked the drainage. He adjusted the angle of the gutter so the watering would be more even. Wren shook his head again. He said he'd never seen a man plant greens as if he were building a palace. Daniel replied that there was no difference. Good work is good work. Wren snorted. Then he fell silent. Then he said quietly that his brother-in-law in the port of Sonhwa traded in seeds. Rare ones. Expensive ones. If the moon salt from Bone Needle turned out to be as good as he thought, they could work out a trade. Daniel looked at him. This was no longer just a merchant in need of water. This was a man who saw an opportunity. Daniel saw it too. Wren left again. He took the salt. He left promises. And a bag of something he called sea onions. He said they grow in rocky crevices. The taste is wild, but they're edible. Daniel was left alone. But now the loneliness felt different. He had a job, a real job, a terrace with seeds, waterfalls that needed tending, trails that needed extending, and a project in his head, a big project. Every evening he sat atop the cliff and drew a mental map of the island's future. The system responded to this. When he thought of specific things, outlines appeared in his mind. Water horizons, potential biomes, points where the microclimate was slightly warmer or slightly more humid. He saw his island layer by layer, like an architectural plan, layer by layer. Stone, water, air, potential. And the potential was enormous. This rock only looked dead. Life was hiding inside it, sleeping, waiting. All that was needed was someone who knew how to wake it up. The ro chai sprouted on the 5th day. Daniel saw the first green dots at dawn and dropped to his knees next to the garden bed. Tiny, pale green, fragile, alive. He sat there for a long time, just watching. Then he noticed something strange. The sprouts weren't just in the garden bed. Tiny green threads were pushing through the bare rock around the terrace. Moss. Not that silvery condenser moss from the waterfalls. Different. Green. Alive. Ordinary. It was creeping out from the terrace in all directions, slowly and carefully clinging to the microcracks in the basalt, as if the terrace were a point from which the circles of life radiated outward. Attraction. The word popped into his head on its own. A healthy ecosystem attracts life. He had created one small, healthy spot on a dead rock, and the rock had begun to come alive around it. Daniel stood up. He looked at the moss, at the sprouts, at the terrace, at his battered hands. He thought that this was exactly what he had been doing his whole life. Finding a dead spot, creating a single living point on it, and watching as life radiated out in circles. In the landfills of Michigan, in the salt flats of Utah, on the mine dumps of Pennsylvania, the principle is the same. Life wants to live. It just needs a place to start. He nodded to himself and went to plan the second terrace. 3 weeks after planting, the rochai was ready to eat. Daniel plucked the first leaf and put it in his mouth. Bitter, with a nutty aftertaste, a little tough. The best thing he'd ever eaten in his life. He ate slowly and carefully, every leaf, because every leaf was a miracle, grown on stone, in soil he had made with his own hands, watered with water he had drawn from a salty spring, on an island where, 3 weeks ago, nothing had grown. He ate a handful of rochai, washed it down with water from the cascade, sat down and watched the sunset. The orange sun was sinking into the ocean. The moss around the terrace already covered an area of several square meters. Here and there, other plants were pushing through his green carpet. He didn't know their names. Small, tenacious, resilient. They came on their own, drawn by the healthy soil. The island was changing, slowly, but changing. And Daniel was changing along with it. The anxiety that had weighed on him in the early days had receded. It hadn't gone away completely, but it had receded. Because he was busy. Because he had a goal. Because every morning he woke up and saw the result of his work. A green spot on the black rock. Small, but growing. Wren returned for the third time a month after his first visit. Another schooner came with him. A bigger one. Wren introduced the captain, a woman named Dora, broad as a barrel, a voice like an anchor chain. She looked at the island, at the green patch of the terrace, at the waterfalls, at the trails. Then she looked at Daniel, then back at the island. She said she didn't believe it. Wren said he hadn't believed it either. Dora went ashore, tasted the water, tasted the salt, stood in silence. Then she turned to Wren and said he hadn't lied. Wren said he never lies when it comes to money. Daniel listened to their conversation and thought. 2 ships, 2 captains. The rumor was spreading. It was inevitable. Wren could keep quiet for a while, but no one can stay silent forever. And Daniel had to decide what to do when the world found out about his island. Dora brought tools, real ones. 2 pickaxes, a crowbar, a saw, nails, boards. Wren brought seeds from his brother-in-law, some kind of local fruit, something like beans, and a bag of real compost from Cargo Island. Daniel accepted the compost with such an expression on his face that Dora later told stories in the harbor taverns about how the Lord of Bone Needle hugged manure like a loved one. It was true. Daniel hugged the compost because compost is life. Every gram of organic matter is thousands of microorganisms. Every microorganism is a building block of soil, and soil is everything. Without soil, there are no plants. Without plants, there is no food. Without food, there are no people. Without people, there is no island. The chain began with manure, and Daniel knew this better than anyone. Dora sailed away that evening. Wren stayed the night. They sat by the fire, the first real campfire on the island. Daniel built the hearth out of stones by the book. Draft, wind protection, a reflective wall to trap the heat. A small thing, but done right. Wren stared at the fire and said nothing. Then he said there were rumors that the empires had finished the season of negotiations and resolved nothing, that Volcania was building new warships, that Lumera had closed 3 southern ports, that the black tide had begun attacking more often and more fiercely. Daniel listened. He understood little of this world's politics, but he understood the tone. Wren spoke like a man awaiting a storm. Wren said that the bone eagle was in neutral waters, that it belonged to no empire, that as long as it was a dead rock, no one cared. But if word of the lunar salt and clean water reached the right ears... Wren didn't finish. He didn't need to. Daniel understood. His little island stood right in the middle between 4 hungry empires, and he had just made it valuable. He looked at the fire, then at the sky. Alien stars, an alien world, alien wars. And in the soil on his terrace grew the root vegetables he had planted 3 weeks ago. Small, stubborn, alive. He thought the wars would have to wait. First, he needed to sort out the compost. The storm came at night on the 40th day. Daniel woke to the howling of the wind and the crash of the waves. The water pounded the eastern shore with such force that the rock shook. He crawled out of the niche and made his way toward the cascades in the darkness. If a wave reached the upper basins, his system would be destroyed. All the work of 3 weeks. The wind blew in his face so hard it was impossible to breathe. The rain lashed horizontally. Daniel crawled along the path on all 4s, clinging to the rocks. He reached the cascades and saw that the waves were already lapping at the lower basin. Another half meter and it would flood everything. He began frantically moving stones, building a retaining wall, in the dark, in the rain. His hands slipped on the wet basalt. He scraped the skin off both palms. Blood mixed with the salt water. It hurt so much that his vision went dark. But he kept working, stone by stone. The wall grew, slowly, too slowly. A wave crashed and spilled over the lower basin. Daniel felt the salt water flooding his cascade, and at that moment, something snapped inside him. Not despair, anger. Pure, searing anger. He placed his hands on the stone and spoke aloud. He spoke directly to the island. He said he needed a wall, a breakwater, 1 meter high, 6 meters long, a semicircle from the northern edge of the cascade to the southern, made of local basalt, a base 1.5 meters wide, a top 0.5 meter wide, trapezoidal in shape, the outer slope at a 15-degree angle to deflect the waves, drainage channels at the base to drain water. He talked and talked. Exact figures, exact parameters, every stone, every angle, every centimeter. He shouted his specifications into the wind, and the wind carried his words away. But the island heard. The stones beneath his hands grew warm and obedient. They moved. Not on their own, he moved them. But they were light, as if the island were helping, as if the rock were giving him its stones. Daniel built all night, in the rain, in the dark, with his hands raw. By dawn, the breakwater stood. Rough, uneven, but it stood. Waves crashed against it and rolled back. The cascades were intact. Daniel sat on the wet stones and shivered. Not from the cold, from what he had just done. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood and calluses. Ordinary hands, but in just one night, they had built a stone wall that a crew of 10 would have taken a week to build. The system didn't do it for him. It helped. The difference is huge. The storm passed by noon. The sky cleared. The sun beat on the wet stones and the island sparkled. Daniel surveyed the damage. The lower basin of the waterfall had cracked. The gutter leading to the terrace had shifted. Part of the row of plants in the garden had been flattened by the wind. But everything was fixable. Everything could be fixed. He began the repairs. And then he noticed something. The breakwater he had built during the night looked different in the daylight. It wasn't just a pile of rocks. The stones lay tightly together, almost without gaps. The joints were smooth, as if someone had fitted them together. And moss had already begun to grow on the inside of the wall. That very same silvery condenser moss. The wall wasn't just protecting the cascades. It had become part of the system. It collected moisture from the air. It directed the condensation into the lower basin. Daniel ran his hand over the stones. Warm. Alive. He thought that the system didn't just accelerate. It optimizes. It takes his design and makes it a little better, a little more precise, a little more harmonious. Like a good engineer who sees a novice's blueprint and silently adjusts the tolerances. The Earth's memory. Another phrase that popped into his head. He realized this when he was repairing a cracked cascade basin. He simply pressed the fragments together and described aloud how the basin should look. The crack healed within an hour. It didn't disappear. The seam remained, but the basin held water again. The island remembered what Daniel created, and it restored itself faster than it had taken to build the first time. He tested this on a section of the trail that had been washed away by a storm. The restoration took half a day instead of the 2 days he had spent building the original. 3 times faster. Daniel stood on his trail and thought, this changed everything. It meant that every creation of his on the island became something of a permanent fixture. The longer something stood, the deeper the island remembered it, the harder it was to destroy. Enemies, if they came, would be breaking something that repaired itself faster than it broke. He thought the word enemies and stopped. He was thinking about enemies for the first time. About people who would want to take his island, his terrace, his waterfalls, his trails. He clenched his fists and looked at the horizon. Empty. Empty for now. He went back to his repairs. On the 45th day after his arrival, Daniel stood atop the central rock and looked down at his island from above. The southern slope was green. The terrace had yielded a second harvest of roe chai. Moss was spreading around it. Small flowers had appeared in the moss, white with blue centers. He hadn't planted them. They had come on their own. The 3 waterfalls were running steadily. The breakwater stood firm. On the western shore, he began a second terrace, a larger one, with 2 levels, with a composting system. Dora brought him fish guts and scraps from cargo ships. He layered them in a stone pit, alternating with seaweed and soil. In 2 weeks, the first real compost should be ready. His island was tiny, ridiculous, a green spot on a black rock. But it was alive. Daniel went downstairs and walked toward the western shore. He needed to check the compost pit. On the way, he stopped by the breakwater wall and placed his hand on the stone. Warm, as always. He said thank you, quietly, to himself. The stone didn't answer, but Daniel could have sworn that the moss on the wall had grown a little thicker. On the 48th day, the ocean brought him Minsu Han. Daniel was working on the second terrace when he heard a sound. Not the creak of a ship, not the splash of oars. A faint thud, as if something heavy had struck the rocks on the eastern shore. He straightened up and listened. Silence. Then again, a thud, and a quiet moan. He dropped the shovel and ran to the eastern shore. There, a plank was wedged between the rocks, a fragment of something. Maybe a rowboat? Maybe a hatch? A figure was tied to the plank with a rope. A woman. Face down, one arm dangled in the water, the other still clutched the rope. Daniel jumped down onto the rocks. The water lapped at his knees. He grabbed the plank and pulled it toward the shore. It was heavy. The woman was unconscious, and her wet clothes weighed like armor. He dragged her onto the rocks, turned her over. A young face, weathered, dark hair matted with salt. Under her left shoulder blade, a fragment jutted out from beneath the torn fabric. An arrow, broken at the base. The skin around the wound was crimson black. A bad sign. A very bad sign. Daniel pressed his fingers to her neck. There was a pulse, weak, thread-like, but it was there. He dragged her to the alcove, the only shelter on the island, his home. He laid her on the spread-out sailcloth. He removed her wet clothes, not out of modesty, but out of necessity. The wet fabric was drawing away her heat. The woman was in bad shape, dehydrated, exhausted. Her skin was gray, her lips were chapped. And the arrow, a black line from the wound, was already spreading along her ribs. Poison, or infection, or both. Daniel wasn't a doctor, but he'd worked in the field for 10 years, at remote sites, with no hospitals nearby. He knew basic first aid, and he knew the most important thing. The arrow had to be removed. If the tip remained inside, the poison would continue to spread. He boiled water over the fire. He heated the knife in the flames. His hands didn't tremble. He was used with stone and soil, not with living flesh. But the principle was the same. Precision. Care. No rushing. He cut through the tissue around the wound. The arrow fragment was not deep, about 3 centimeters under the skin. The tip was serrated, made of some dark metal. Daniel gripped the fragment with his fingers. His palms burned. Not from the heat, but from something else, as if the metal were biting him. He clenched his teeth and pulled, smoothly, in one motion. The tip came out with a squelch. Black blood spurted onto the canvas. The woman flinched and screamed, muffled, through clenched teeth, but she didn't wake up. Daniel rinsed the wound with boiled water. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He tore a handful of moss from the breakwater, silvery, the very same condenser moss that the system had grown on its cascades. He didn't know if this moss had healing properties, but it had grown on a healthy island, in clean water, on a rock that Daniel knew by name. He applied the moss to the wound and secured it with a strip of cloth. Then he covered the woman with dry canvas. He gave her water from the waterfall, drop by drop, through the wet cloth pressed against her lips, and sat down beside her. She didn't regain consciousness until morning. Daniel sat there all night. He placed a wet cloth on her forehead. He changed the moss on the wound. He gave her more water. By dawn, her skin had turned pink. Her pulse had strengthened. The black line from the wound stopped spreading. The moss had worked. Or the water. Or both. Or the island had decided that this person needed to live here. Daniel didn't know. In the morning, he removed the bandage and saw that the wound was already closing. It hadn't healed, but it had started to, faster than it should have, much faster. He applied fresh moss. The woman opened her eyes closer to noon. Gray eyes, heavy, like stones at the bottom of a well. She looked at Daniel, at the alcove, at the sailcloth. Her hand darted to her hip, where the knife should have been. The knife wasn't there. Daniel had taken it when he undressed her. He showed her the knife, placed it next to her hand, not at a distance, close by, within reach. She stared at him without blinking. He said she was on an island, that he pulled out the arrow, that the wound was healing, that there was water nearby, and food too. He spoke calmly, just as he spoke to frightened animals at the facilities. Slowly, steadily, without sudden movements. The woman was silent. Then her fingers closed around the knife's handle. Not threateningly, habitually, as if picking up a familiar object. She closed her eyes and fell asleep again. She didn't let go of the knife. For 3 days, Min-Soo didn't speak. She drank water. She ate the rochai that Daniel brought her. She slept. She woke up. She checked the knife. She fell asleep again. On the 4th day, she got up. Daniel returned from the terrace and saw her standing at the entrance to the alcove. She was looking at the island, at the green terrace, at the waterfalls, at the breakwater, at the paths. Then she turned to him and asked her first question. She asked where everyone else was. Daniel said he was the only one here. She looked at him as if he'd said something impossible. Then she looked at the island, then back at him. She said, "One person couldn't have built all of this." Daniel shrugged and said that technically he'd had a month and a half, and a shovel. Min-Soo didn't smile. She didn't smile at all. But something in her face had changed. Maybe it had become a little less sharp. She asked if she could stay until the wound healed. Daniel said she could stay as long as she wanted. Min-Soo looked at him with a long, impenetrable gaze. Then she nodded. She took a mug of water. She stepped out onto the trail, and she walked across the island, alone, slowly, carefully, like a person who had long since forgotten how to walk on ground that didn't want to kill her. Min-Soo didn't speak, but she worked. Daniel noticed this on the 2nd day after she got up. He went to the west shore to check the compost pit, and when he returned, he found that the pile of stones he had stacked for the 2nd terrace had been sorted by size, by shape, neatly, as if it had been done by someone who had worked with their hands their whole life and knew exactly which stone would go where. Min-Soo was sitting at the entrance to the alcove, sharpening her knife on a stone. She didn't look at him. Daniel looked at the stones, then at her. He said thank you. She nodded. On the 3rd day, he found fresh fish on a rock by the waterfall. 3 of them, gutted, clean. Min-Soo had caught them with her bare hands in the tidal pools. He saw that later. She moved quickly and precisely. Her hand went into the water and came out with a fish. Not a single wasted movement. A hunter, not a fisherwoman. A hunter who had adapted to what was available. Daniel roasted the fish over the fire. It was the first hot, protein-rich meal in a month and a half. He ate and nearly cried at the taste. Min-Soo ate in silence, quickly, like someone who was used to having food taken away. They had worked out a routine without words. Daniel worked on the terraces. Min-Soo hunted and fished. She brought back whatever she found, a certain kind of seaweed, shells, bird eggs from distant rocks where Daniel hadn't yet ventured. The birds had appeared recently, small gray seabirds. They began to perch on the rocks around the waterfalls. The attraction was working. A healthy ecosystem attracted life. First moss, then flowers, then birds. Then fish began to appear more often near the shores. Daniel saw this every day. The island was coming to life, slowly but surely, and Min-Soo was part of this process. She brought to the island what it lacked: protein, fats, diversity. Daniel understood this as a landscape architect. A healthy ecosystem is not a monoculture. It is diversity. Each element complements the others. Min-Soo complemented him. He built, she gathered. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. On the 10th day of their life together, Min-Soo spoke, not to Daniel, to the island. Daniel was working on the upper terrace and heard her voice from the northern slope. Quiet, hoarse. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, looking out at the sea, and speaking. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't try. He turned away and went back to work. That evening, she sat down next to the fire and spoke her first sentence to him in 10 days. She said that the northern cliff was a good vantage point. You could see in 3 directions. The only blind spot was from the southwest. Daniel looked at her. She was talking about tactics, about positions, about the view. He asked who she expected to attack. Min-soo looked him in the eyes, for the first time ever, and said, "From everyone." Daniel didn't ask for details. Instead, he said that if she showed him good vantage points, he could map out trails to them. Min-soo looked at him for a second, 2, 3. Then she nodded. That was the beginning. The following week, they walked around the island together. Min-soo showed him. Daniel listened. The northern cliff, views to the northeast and northwest. The western crevice, natural cover for 2. The southern ridge, a long line of sight to the horizon. She saw the island differently than he did. He saw soil and water horizons and potential biomes. She saw lines of fire and dead zones and escape routes. 2 completely different perspectives on the same land, and both were necessary. Daniel didn't realize this right away. He was used to thinking of the land as a space for living. Min-soo thought of it as a space for survival. The difference was subtle but critical. He was building a home. She was securing the perimeter. He was designing trails for convenience. She was adjusting them for safety. This trail is too exposed. We need a turn here so there's no direct line of sight from the sea. The rock is slippery here, bad for a retreat. Daniel listened and made changes. His trails got better. Not just safer, better. Because good design takes all functions into account, and protection is a function too. Min-soo began to tell her story, not with words, with actions. From the way she moved, Daniel could tell she was a soldier, or had been a soldier. Every gesture was economical, every step measured. She never turned her back on open space, never sat down without checking what was behind her. She slept lightly, woke at the slightest sound, a knife always at her side. The wound on her shoulder was healing quickly. By the end of the second week, Min-soo was already moving almost normally. The moss from the island was changed every 2 days. The black line from the poison receded and vanished. The scar remained, rough, crimson, but clean. She took off the bandage and stared at the scar for a long time. Then she looked at Daniel. He was waiting for her to say, "Thank you." She said that arrows used to hit her more often. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Min-soo got up and went fishing. 3 days later after that, she told him. Not everything, but enough. They were sitting by the fire after dinner. Min-soo was sharpening a knife. Daniel was sketching a plan for the 3rd terrace on a piece of bark. She began to speak in an even voice, without emotion, as if reporting. The Han clan, a Lumerian border clan, 6 generations of hunters and trackers. They served the Lumerian Council of Priests. They guarded the southern borders. They tracked down smugglers, intruders, refugees. Min-soo said the last word and paused for a second. Then she continued. 2 years ago, the Council of Priests issued a new order. Refugees from the eastern islands were no longer to be detained. They were to be eliminated. Without trial, without inquiry. The clan obeyed. Min-soo obeyed for a year and a half. Then there was the village on the shore. Fishermen, women, children, 12 people. The order was to wipe them out. Min-soo stood on a hill with a bow in her hands. Below, a girl of about 5 was collecting seashells on the beach. Min-soo lowered her bow, turned around, and walked away. An hour later, 3 men were sent after her, her own people, from the clan. An arrow caught up with her on the 3rd day of the chase. She pulled out the shaft, but the tip remained inside. She stole a boat. The boat was wrecked by a storm. A plank carried her to Bone Needle. Min-soo finished. She sheathed her knife. She looked at the fire. Her face was stony. Daniel was silent. For a long time. Then he said one thing. He said that on the northern cliff there was a good spot for a hut. with a window facing east. If she wanted, he could design it. Minsu looked at him. Something shifted behind her stony face, something small and fragile, like a rochai sprout pushing through the basalt. She nodded. Once. Daniel began designing the hut the next day. A small one, 2 by 3 meters. Stone walls made of local basalt. A roof of wooden beams covered with canvas and moss. A window facing east. A doorway facing south. Protection from the north wind provided by the rock behind it. He calculated. He sketched. He spoke aloud. Every stone, every corner. A foundation 20 centimeters deep in the bedrock. Walls 30 centimeters thick for insulation. Height 2 meters 10 centimeters. The roof slopes southward for rainwater runoff. A gutter around the perimeter. Insulating moss between the stones. He worked on the project for 3 days. The system responded. The stones fit tightly. The walls rose evenly. Moss appeared in the right places. By the end of the 3rd day, the hut stood. The first building on bone needle. Small, rough, but real. With a roof. With a door. With a window from which you could see the sun rising from the ocean. Daniel brought Minsu. She stood at the entrance and looked inside. Inside was a stone floor covered with moss, a bed made of flat stones, a niche for belongings. Nothing superfluous, everything necessary. Minsu went inside. She ran her hand along the wall. She looked out the window for a long time. Daniel stood outside and waited. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stony. But when she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, softer. She said she had never lived in the house that had been built for her. Daniel said that technically the island had built the house. He had only drawn it. Minsu didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Maybe. For a second. Ren returned 5 days later, and he wasn't alone. 2 schooners came with him. Ren, Dora, and a 3rd captain whom Daniel didn't know. A young guy with an earring and a smile that was too wide. His name was Taro. They went ashore, and the first thing they saw was the hut on the northern cliff. Ren whistled. Dora cursed. Taro laughed and said he'd heard there was a madman living on Bone Needle, but he hadn't thought it would be this bad. Daniel walked out to the shore. Minsu was standing nearby, with a knife at her hip, with her back straight, with a heavy gaze that made Taro stop laughing. Ren looked at her, then at Daniel. He raised an eyebrow. Daniel said that was Minsu. She lives here. Ren nodded. He didn't ask a single question. A smart man. Ren brought news, and it was bad. Word had reached the Sanhua trading houses. Moon salt from Bone Needle. Someone from Doe's crew had let it slip in a port tavern. 2 trading houses had already organized expeditions. Not trading ones, reconnaissance ones. They wanted to understand what was going on here. How a rock in neutral waters produced moon salt, and whether they could take it for themselves. Ren spoke of this without panic, in a business-like tone, as if it were a business problem, because for him, it was a business problem. Daniel listened and counted the time. If the expeditions were already equipped, if they would leave the port of Sanhua in the coming days, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then there would be strangers here, with questions, with money, with intentions. Daniel looked at his island, at the terraces, at the waterfalls, at Minsu's hut, at the moss and flowers, at the birds above the water, at the trails he had carved out with his own hands. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to turn his little garden into something bigger, into something that couldn't simply be taken away. He turned to Ren and asked what exactly the 3rd ship had brought. Wren smiled. Taro opened the hold. Inside were sacks, dozens of sacks, compost, seeds, tools, boards, nails, fabric, and one small wooden cage. 3 chickens sat in the cage. Daniel looked at the chickens. The chickens looked at Daniel. He said he'd asked for chickens. Wren said he knew. That's why he'd brought them. Daniel thought this was the first time the system had given him exactly what he'd asked for. Then he realized the system had nothing to do with it. It was Wren, just a good trading partner. Sometimes reality worked better than any magic. Unloading took the whole day. Min-Soo helped in silence. She hauled sacks just as well as the sailors. Wren watched and shook his head. Taro tried to joke with her, once. She looked at him. Taro fell silent for the rest of the day. By evening, all the supplies were on shore. Daniel stood in the midst of this wealth, and his mind was working like a processing data. Compost, that's the priority. New terraces, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, seeds. He needs to study every variety, figure out what's what grows where. Chickens, they need a pen, and feed, and shelter from the wind. Tools, finally, real tools. He can work 3 times faster. Boards, furniture, shelves, maybe a second hut. 2 weeks, 14 days. 728 working hours if he doesn't sleep. If he sleeps, then fewer. Daniel looked at Min-Soo. Min-Soo looked at him. He said they didn't have much time. She said she knew. He asked if she could handle it if he slept 4 hours. She said he would sleep 6 and eat 3 times a day, because if he collapsed from exhaustion, she wouldn't be the one to pull him out. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him, without blinking. He nodded. 6 hours of sleep, 3 meals a day, and work the rest of the time. Daniel worked like a man possessed. 14 days. 14 days to turn the garden into a settlement. He drew up a plan that very first night. Sitting by the fire, he sketched on a piece of wood and spoke aloud. Min-Soo sat beside him and listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. The plan was this: 3 new terraces on the southern slope, an expansion of the cascade system, a chicken coop, a second hut, paths to all key points, and most importantly, a garden, a real garden, not a vegetable patch with rose tea, a garden with trees, with fruit trees. Wren brought 3 saplings, small, skinny, half dead after the trip. Daniel looked at them and saw not half-dead sticks, but trees. In a year, in 2 years, with fruit, with shade, with roots that hold the soil. Trees are anchors. They hold the ecosystem as columns hold a roof. Without trees, everything else is temporary. With trees, the island becomes a home. He chose the spot for the garden himself, not from a blueprint. He walked the southern slope 4 times, sat down at every spot. He closed his eyes. He listened. He searched for that special place where everything came together. Light, wind, water, warmth from the stone. He found it. A small clearing between the 2nd and 3rd terraces, sheltered by a rock face to the north, open to the sun from the south, with access to water from the cascade. Perfect. He dug the holes for the saplings himself. The shovel went into the ground more easily than it had a month and a half ago. The soil on the southern slope was changing. Moss and self-sown plants added organic matter. Worms appeared a week ago, small, reddish ones. They came from nowhere, or from the ocean with the seaweed, or from the compost Wren brought, or the island attracted them. Daniel didn't know and didn't ask. Worms are life. Worms aerate the soil. Worms are organic matter processing. He was happier about the worms than the chickens. The holes were deep, 1/2 meter in every dimension. He filled them with a mixture of local soil and compost. He added crushed seashells. He added ashes from the fire. He added fish bones that Min-soo had been hoarding in the corner. Each sapling got its own hole, its own mixture, its own portion of water, and its own specifications. Daniel spoke aloud the parameters for each tree: root collar depth, distance between trees, direction of wind protection, expected growth, expected time of first fruiting. He didn't know the local varieties, but he knew trees. He knew how a tree breathes, how it drinks, how it grows. And the system knew that he knew. The saplings took root in 3 days. The leaves that were yellow when planted turned green. The trunks straightened. The roots went deep. Daniel checked on them every morning. He felt the soil around the trunks. He sniffed. He tasted it. He talked to the trees. Not in his mind, out loud. He told each one that he had good soil, good water, good neighbors. That there was no need to rush. That there was time. Min-soo, hearing him talk to the trees for the first time, stopped on the path and watched him for several minutes. Then she left without saying a word. That evening, she asked if he always talked to the plants. Daniel said yes, always, to the plants, to the soil, with stones. He hears everything. Min-soo thought about it. Then she said she used to talk to her bow, before every shot. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. It was the first moment when something connected between them. Not attraction, understanding. Two people who talk to things that don't answer. And both know it's not madness, it's respect. The terraces grew quickly. With real tools, the work went 3 times faster. A shovel, a pickaxe, a saw. Every tool saved several hours a day. Daniel built the 3rd terrace in 2 days instead of 4. The 4th in a day and a half. The 5th in a day. The system responded to his growing experience. The more precisely he formulated his thoughts, the better he understood his island, the faster the island responded. The stones settled more evenly. The soil compacted more firmly. Moss appeared faster. Each new terrace was better than the last. Not because the system was getting stronger, because Daniel was getting more precise. He was learning to speak to the island in its language. And that language was the language of concrete things. Not wishes, not abstractions. Concrete details. A 3-degree slope. A 20-centimeter drainage layer. 150 milliliters of water per square meter per day. The system didn't understand the word beautiful, but it understood the word 30 centimeters perfectly. He built the chicken coop on the 4th day, between the 1st and 2nd terraces. Stone walls, a wooden roof, a wire pen, nests made of moss and dry seaweed. 3 hens inspected their new home with the kind of expression that only chickens have. Utter contempt. Then one pecked at the moss. The 2nd pecked at a stone. The 3rd pecked Daniel on the finger. He decided they liked it. The chickens started laying on the 2nd day. Daniel found the first egg in the nest that morning. Warm, white, small. He stood there with the egg in his hand and thought it was the most precious thing on the island. More precious than moon salt. More precious than the waterfalls. More precious than anything. Because an egg is protein. Protein is the building material for the body, and his body was his main tool. Without a healthy body, there would be no terraces, no waterfalls, no island. He boiled the egg in hot water, cut it in half. He ate 1 half. He took the other to Min-soo. She looked at the egg, then at him. She took it. She ate it. She said nothing. But that evening, she brought him 4 fish instead of the usual 2. On the 6th day, Daniel began building a 2nd hut. Not for himself, for guests, or for those who might come and want to stay, or simply because one hut is a shelter and two huts are a settlement. He built it on the southern slope next to the terraces, larger than Min Su's hut, 3 by 4 meters, with 2 windows, with a stone hearth inside, with shelves for belongings, with a bench for 2. He built and spoke each element into existence. The system responded. The stones fell into place, the walls rose, the roof settled evenly, moss filled the cracks. By evening on the 7th day, the hut was ready. Daniel stood before it and wondered, for whom? He didn't know, but he felt he would soon find out. The island drew people just as it drew birds and fish and moss. A healthy ecosystem attracts life. It worked not only for plants. On the 8th day, Min Su called him to the northern cliff. She pointed toward the horizon. Daniel squinted. Far away, right at the edge of visibility, a sail. Not a merchant schooner, something bigger. Min Su said it was a warship. By the shape of the sails, by the silhouette. A warship. Daniel asked whose. Min Su said she didn't know, too far away, but it was heading their way. Daniel watched the sail and counted the days. 1 day, maybe 2. Maybe it wasn't for them. Maybe it was passing by. Maybe. But maybe not. He went down to the shore and started working faster. The 9th day, the 10th, 11th. He slept 4 hours a night despite the promise he'd made to Min Su. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but his portion of fish tripled. And every evening, a hot brew of local herbs appeared by his bed, which Min Su had brewed in a stone bowl. Bitter, invigorating. Daniel drank and worked. Trails, expanding the cascades. The 6th terrace, reinforcing the breakwater. On the 12th day, the warship vanished from the horizon. Gone. Past them. Not to them. Daniel exhaled so hard his head spun. Min Su looked at him and said that next time they might not be so lucky. He nodded. He knew. On the 13th day, Ren returned alone, without Dora, without Taro. His face was serious. He stepped ashore, and the first thing he said was that they had a problem. The So trading house from Sanwa, one of the largest, they had sent the head of the house's youngest daughter with an official delegation. The goal? To assess the island's potential, to propose a contract, or to buy, or to lease, or take it. Ren didn't specify the wording because the wording depended on what the delegation would see. Daniel asked when. Ren said in 2 or 3 days. The schooner was already on its way. Daniel closed his eyes. 2 days. Not 14 as he had expected. 2. He looked at his island. 6 terraces, a green southern slope, young trees in the garden, waterfalls, a breakwater, 2 huts, trails, a chicken coop, moss like a carpet around every living spot, flowers, birds, fish off the shore. For a man who had started with a bare rock 2 months ago, it was a miracle. To the So trading house, it was a small, dirty vegetable garden on a cliff. Daniel sat down on a rock and began to think. Ren sat down beside him. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that the daughter of the head of the So household was Ji-Ah So, 22 years old, the youngest, the unloved one. Sent to the ends of the earth to fail or disappear. Her brothers want her inheritance. Her father wants peace. Ji-A wants to prove she's not a nobody. Ren said all this in a tone as if he were describing the weather, without judgment, just facts. Daniel listened. Then he asked what Ji-A knew. Ren said she knew that moon salt was produced on Bone Needle. She knew the island belonged to one man. She knew that man was a stranger with no family or flag. And she knows that if she brings back a contract for the exclusive supply of moon salt to the So house, the brothers will choke on their inheritance. Daniel thought. Then he asked what would happen if he refused. Ren looked at him for a long time. Then he said that the So house is the fourth most influential in the Sanhua Empire. They have 12 merchant ships. 3 of them are warships. If they don't get the contract the nice way, they'll come back the hard way, and they'll bring the imperial fleet for escort. Daniel looked at his island, at his 6 terraces, 3 chickens, and 2 inhabitants. Then he looked at the horizon, where somewhere out there a schooner was sailing with the daughter of the trading house, and her arrival could be the beginning of the end, or the beginning of something new. Ren asked what he was going to do. Daniel stood up, he brushed off his hands, and said that, for starters, he needed to tidy up the guest hut, because if the daughter of the trading house was coming to visit him, he would at least provide her with a clean place to sleep. Ren looked at him, then he laughed. For the first time since they'd met, Daniel saw Ren laugh. Ren said that Daniel was either the smartest person he'd ever met, or the craziest. Daniel said that in his line of work, it was one and the same. 2 days went by in preparation. Daniel wasn't preparing for negotiations. He was preparing the island. It was his territory, and he wanted the island to speak for itself. He cleared the trails, trimmed the moss by the waterfalls. He checked every bowl. He repaired the gutters. He weeded the terraces. He staked the young saplings. He cleaned the chicken coop. He tidied up the guest hut. Inside, he laid out fresh moss. He collected clean water. He placed a handful of moon salt in a stone bowl on the shelf. A small gesture, but a precise one. Minsu watched his preparations and on the second day said he was preparing as if for battle. Daniel replied that negotiations are a battle, just with different weapons. Minsu looked at him with something resembling respect or interest. It was hard to tell with her. The schooner arrived at dawn on the 15th day. Daniel stood on the southern ridge and watched it emerge from the morning mist. A beautiful ship. Fresh paint, white sails bearing the trading house's golden emblem. Not a battered Ren vessel. A real merchant ship. People stood on the deck. About 10, maybe 12. Sailors, guards, and a single figure at the bow. Small, upright, in layers of clothing that were completely impractical for a sea voyage. Jia So. Daniel went down to the shore. Minsu was already there, with a knife at her hip, with her back straight, with a face that told everyone who looked that there was someone here to be feared. The schooner dropped anchor 50 meters from the shore. The rowboat was lowered. Jia stepped out first. Small, fragile-looking, 6 layers of silk, her hair styled in an elaborate updo, high-heeled shoes. On the rocky shore, she stepped onto a rock. Her heel sank into a crevice. She didn't waver, didn't falter. She pulled her leg out, stepped over, kept walking, with the face of someone who would rather die than show any awkwardness. Daniel watched, and in that moment he realized 2 things. First, this woman is not weak. Second, she's going to be very interesting. Jia stopped 3 steps away from him. She looked at him. Looking down on him, even though she was a head shorter, she knew how to do that. To look down on people and up at them. Behind her stood 2 bodyguards, large, armed, with the blank faces of professionals. Jia surveyed the island, terraces, huts, waterfalls, trails. Her face didn't change. No surprise, no admiration, no contempt. Nothing. A perfect mask. She said she was a representative of the So trading house of the Sanhua Empire and that she was authorized to negotiate supplies. Her voice was even, businesslike, with a slight hint of boredom that was just as fake as her indifferent face. Daniel saw her eyes dart toward the waterfall when she saw the bluish glint of salt. 1 second, then the mask was back. But he noticed that second. He said he was glad to have guests and suggested they go up first to look around the island, then talk. Jia looked at the path, at the rocks, at her heels. Then she looked at Daniel. He expected her to refuse. She said she'd be happy to, and she walked up the stone path in her heels, without holding on, without stumbling. Minsu walked behind her. Daniel saw that Minsu was looking at Jia with an expression he had learned to recognize. Threat assessment. Minsu assessed everyone, always. It didn't work. Daniel showed Jia around the island. He showed her the cascades. He explained the principle, not the whole thing, just enough to make it clear. He showed her the terraces, the garden with young trees, the chicken coop, the paths, the breakwater. Jia walked and listened. The mask held. But Daniel saw small cracks. When she leaned toward the cascade and saw the condenser moss, the fingers of her left hand clenched. When she tasted the water from the lower basin, her pupils dilated. When she saw the salt crystals, she paused for half a second longer than necessary. Daniel read her as he read his land, layer by layer. The top layer was a mask, indifference, boredom, a businesslike tone. Beneath that, fear. She was afraid of returning empty-handed. Beneath the fear, interest. She saw value. Beneath the interest, something else, something Daniel couldn't read yet. He led her to the guest hut. He opened the door. Jia entered. She looked at the stone floor covered in moss, at the sleeping platform, at the bowl of moon salt on the shelf, at the window overlooking the ocean. The mask cracked for a second. Surprise flashed across her face. Genuine, alive. Then the mask returned. She turned to him and said the terms were acceptable. Daniel nodded. He said negotiations would begin tomorrow morning, and now she should rest after the journey. Jia looked at him. She had expected pressure, haste, nervousness, a man desperate to make a sale. Instead, she got a man who offered her a chance to rest. She nodded. Daniel left. He closed the door and walked to the northern cliff toward Minsu. Minsu stood by the window of her hut and looked at the schooner in the cove. Daniel sat down beside her. They were silent. Then Minsu said that the woman was dangerous. Daniel said yes. Minsu said that the guards were professionals. Daniel said yes. Minsu paused. Then she said the guest hut was beautiful. Daniel looked at her. Minsu didn't look at him. She was looking at the schooner, but the tips of her ears were slightly pink. Daniel thought it was probably from the wind. Then he thought there was no wind right now. Then he decided not to think about it. Tomorrow there would be negotiations. Tomorrow, much would be decided. Today, he had an island. He had water, he had salt, he had 3 trees growing, 3 chickens laying eggs, 1 silent hunter with a knife, and 1 merchant princess in silk who had come to take his home. Daniel looked at the sunset. The sky was red, the ocean was golden, the island was warm. He thought that, actually, his starting conditions weren't bad. The morning began with fog. Daniel woke up in a niche on the southern slope, and the first thing he did was the waterfalls. The water flowed evenly. The salt had crystallized. The moss was damp and healthy. He washed his face, ate an egg and a handful of rocha, drank 2 handfuls of water. Then he went to the guest hut. Jia was already standing outside, in fresh silk, with a hairstyle that looked as if it had taken an hour to do. On a rocky island in the middle of the ocean, Daniel thought that this woman would rather drown than go out in public with her hair uncombed. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said she was ready to negotiate. Daniel nodded and led her to a clearing by the garden. He had chosen this spot on purpose. 3 young trees, green terraces behind them, a view of the ocean ahead, waterfalls murmuring to the right. Not an office, not a conference room. His territory, his terms. They sat on the rocks facing each other. Jia's guards stood 10 paces away. Minsu sat on the northern rock with a knife on her lap. Everyone could see everything. Everyone understood everything. Jia began. She spoke quickly and precisely. The So Trading House is offering an exclusive contract to supply lunar salt. For a term of 10 years, fixed price. The So House will handle logistics and security for the trade routes. In return, Daniel agrees not to sell the salt to other buyers. The terms are generous. The price she quoted was 3 times higher than what Ren was making at the port. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just listened. When Jia finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he asked one thing. He asked what would happen to the island if the So Trading House decided the contract wasn't profitable in 5 years. Jia didn't blink. She said that a contract is a contract. Daniel shook his head. He said he wasn't asking about the paper, he was asking about reality. If, in 5 years, it would be more profitable for the So family to take the island than to pay for the salt, what would happen? Jia was silent. 3 seconds. 5. 10. Her mask didn't waver, but the silence was her answer. Daniel nodded. He understood. The contract is a leash. A long one. A beautiful one. With a gold carabiner. But a leash. And he's no dog. He made a counteroffer. Not a contract, a partnership. No exclusivity. The So House gets the right of first refusal, the best price on the market, priority in deliveries, but not a monopoly. Daniel reserves the right to sell to anyone. And a second condition. House So supplies the island with what Daniel needs. Seeds, tools, materials, seedlings, at market price. Not inflated, not discounted. Fair. Jia listened to him with the expression of someone trying to figure out if the other person was serious. She said it was unacceptable. Daniel said he understood. He stood up. He walked to the waterfall, scooped up some water, returned, placed a stone bowl of water in front of her, set 3 crystals of moon salt beside it. Told her to think it over. There was no rush. She could stay on the island as long as she needed. Then he went to work on the terrace. Jia remained sitting by the garden, with the bowl of water, with the 3 crystals, and with the expression of someone who had just been politely and irrevocably rejected. She didn't leave. Daniel hadn't expected her to leave. A person sent to the ends of the earth to disappear doesn't return empty-handed. Jia spent the day on the island. She walked, she looked, she calculated. Daniel saw her touching the walls of the hut, checking the masonry, leaning toward the waterfall and studying the system, taking a handful of soil from the terrace and rubbing it between her fingers. She was calculating the cost of salt, production volume, potential, logistics. He could see it in her eyes. Her eyes moved like abacuses, left and right, up and down. Every glance was a column of numbers. That evening, she came out to the terrace to see him. Daniel was weeding the garden bed. His hands were elbow deep in the soil. His shirt was dirty. Sweat beaded on his forehead. She stood over him in her silks and watched silently. Then she sat down beside him, right on the ground. The silk touched the soil, and she didn't flinch. It took effort. Daniel saw her fingers clench for a second, but she sat down and spoke in a different voice. Not a business voice, a real one. She said that Daniel's terms were unfavorable for the So family, that without exclusivity, the contract made no sense, that her father wouldn't accept such an offer, that her brothers would laugh at him. Daniel kept weeding. He listened. She went on. She said she understood why he was refusing, that if she were in his place, she would refuse too, that exclusivity was a trap. But without it, she couldn't go back. Daniel stopped. He looked at her. She wasn't playing games. She wasn't bargaining. She was telling the truth. For her, it was just as dangerous as it was for him to sign an exclusive contract. To return empty-handed meant losing. To lose meant losing everything. Daniel wiped his hands on his pants. He sat down beside her. He thought. Then he said one thing that changed everything. He said he didn't need a business partner. He needed a master of trade, a man who would take his salt and turn it into a legend. Packaging, brand, presentation, moon salt from bone needle, rare, unique, the only one in the archipelago. If anyone does this right, the price will go up tenfold, and that someone will have their name on every bag. Not the Sow House, a name. So. Personally. She looked at him. The mask fell. Completely. There was something on her face that Daniel had seen before. On the faces of young architects who were being asked to sign their own project for the first time. Hunger. Not for money. Hunger for recognition. Her whole life she had been an asset, a commodity, a pawn in someone else's game. She had never been offered the chance to put her name on anything. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked quietly why he was entrusting this work to her. Daniel looked at her and said that he had seen how she calculated, that in a single day on the island, she had calculated the volume of salt production in her head with a margin of error of less than 5%, that she was the only person he had ever met in this world who looked at things and saw a system rather than an object. Gia stood up. She brushed off her silk. She looked at the terraces, at the cascades, at the salt crystals glistening in the evening sun. Then she looked at her hands. Small, clean, not a single callus. She said she needed a day to prepare a counteroffer. Daniel nodded. She went into the guest hut. He stayed on the terrace. Min-Soo approached from behind, quietly, as always. She asked if he trusted her. Daniel said no, not yet, but he trusted what he had seen, and what he had seen was a person who, for the first time in her life, had been offered the chance to be something more than a commodity. Min-Soo thought for a moment. Then she said it was a dangerous gamble. Daniel said that all his bets were dangerous. He was a landscape architect on a foreign planet. His whole life was now a dangerous gamble. Gia came out the next morning with a sheet of parchment covered in small handwriting. She had worked all night. Daniel saw the light in the hut's window until dawn. The proposal was brilliant. Not a contract between the island and the Sow House, a separate commercial enterprise. Gia So as managing partner, the island as the producer, the Sow House as a limited participation investor. The Sow family share 40% of the profits, the island share 60%. Exclusivity for 2 years, then a review. Logistics at the Sow family's expense. Branding by Gia. Production by Daniel. Daniel read and smiled. Not because the terms were ideal, they weren't, but because Gia had in her life had written something of her own, not dictated by her father, not following her brother's template, her own, and that was good. He made 3 amendments. Exclusivity for 1 year, not 2. A 50-50 split, not 40-60. And 1 special condition. Gia personally visits the island at least once a month for quality control. Gia read his amendments. She raised an eyebrow at the last point. She asked why. Daniel said that the quality of the salt depends on the condition of the cascades. The condition of the Cascades depends on the condition of the island. If she wants to sell the best salt in the archipelago, she needs to know where it comes from. Not from reports, in person. Jia looked at him, then at the island, then at her silk shoes caked in mud. She said she would need different shoes. Daniel said Ren could bring some. Jia nodded. She took out a brush, signed the parchment. Daniel signed next to her. The Bone Needle's first treaty with the outside world. Not a vassal treaty, not a colonial one. A partnership. Jia rolled up the parchment, put it in a case, looked at Daniel, and smiled for the first time. Not a business smile, a real one. Small, quick, like a flash. She said he was the strangest person she'd ever met. Daniel said he heard that a lot, usually before someone offered him a job. Jia left that same day. The schooner sailed off toward the horizon, and on the shore remained 2 boxes of supplies she had ordered to be left behind. Silk ribbons for wrapping salt, empty glass vials, wooden boxes with P.S. and a note. Daniel unfolded it. There were numbers, the quantities she needed by her next visit. Next to them, a small postscript. She wrote that the vials were for the first batch of premium salt, that each vial must contain exactly 100 grams, that the salt must be sorted by crystal size, large ones separately, small ones separately, dust separately. 3 categories, 3 prices. Daniel read and shook his head. She had been on the island for 2 days and had already reorganized his production? He looked at the Cascades. 100 grams per vial, 3 categories. Sorting. He needed more Cascades, more salt, better quality. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The next 3 weeks were the most productive since his arrival. Daniel built 4 more Cascades, each one better than the last. He experimented with the shape of the bowls, with the angle of inclination, with the type of stone for the walls. Different stones yielded different crystallization rates. Different rates yielded different crystal sizes. He learned to control the process. Large crystals for premium salt, small ones for mass market salt, dust for culinary salt. 3 products from a single process. GA was right. Sorting tripled the value. Minsu helped, silently, efficiently. She hauled stones, cleaned the bowls, she sorted the salt. Her fingers were surprisingly precise for someone who had held a weapon all her life. Daniel noticed this and told her. She looked at her hands and said that a hunter needs steady hands. An arrow doesn't forgive a tremor. Daniel thought that salt didn't either. They worked side by side, in silence. The silence between them ceased to be awkward. It became functional, like the silence between 2 masters who know what they're doing and don't need words. The island continued to change. Moss already covered half the southern slope. The green patch was spreading. Flowers appeared every week, new ones, different ones, white, blue, why? They came from nowhere, from the ocean, with the wind, with the birds, which were growing in number. Daniel counted the species, 3 species of seabirds, 2 species of land birds, small brown songbirds that had settled in the moss near the waterfalls, and large gray gulls that had begun to build nests on the northern cliff, on Bone Needle, on the island where, according to legend, not even seagulls build nests. Daniel stood at the summit and watched the seagulls. Then he looked down, at the green southern slope, at the blue strip of flowers along the path, at the silvery moss on the breakwater, at the 3 small trees in the garden that were already reaching his shoulder. 2.5 months. He had been here for 2.5 months. And the bare black rock was beginning to breathe. He closed his eyes and placed his palm on the stone. It floating, alive. The island hummed, quietly, deeply, like a heart. The 3rd month began with a storm, not like the first one, stronger. A 3-day hurricane swept down on Bone Needle from the northwest and turned the ocean into a boiling cauldron. Waves crashed over the breakwater. The wind tore the moss from the rocks. The rain pounded so hard it was impossible to stand. Daniel and Minsu spent 3 days in Minsu's hut on the northern cliff. His niche on the southern slope had flooded on the very first night. They sat in the dark and listened to the ocean roar. Minsu was calm, accustomed to bad weather. Daniel counted the losses. Every wave crash meant a damaged waterfall. Every gust of wind meant torn off moss. Every hour of the storm meant hours of restoration work. He sat there, mentally going over every element of his island: the trails, the terraces, the waterfalls, the garden, the chicken coop. Everything he had built in 2.5 months could be destroyed in 3 days. And there was nothing he could do. Only wait. The storm passed at dawn on the 4th day. Daniel went outside and stopped. The island looked like it had been bombed. The southern slope was washed away. 3 of the 6 terraces were damaged. The bottom 2 were completely destroyed. The soil had been washed into the ocean. Plants were uprooted. The cascades. 2 of the 7 were destroyed, 3 were damaged. The breakwater had held, but lost its top row of stones. The chicken coop had survived. The chickens were angry, but alive. The garden. Daniel approached the garden and froze. 2 of the 3 trees were still standing. Bent, beaten, but standing. The 3rd lay on the ground, its roots torn from the soil, the trunk broken at the base. Dead. Daniel stood over the dead tree and felt something hot rise from his stomach to his throat. He had planted that tree, with his own hands, in a hole he'd dug for half a day. He'd talked to it every morning. He knew its slant, its shape, the direction of its branches. Now it lay on the rock with its roots torn out. Daniel crouched down. He placed his hand on the trunk. Cold, wet, dead. He sat like that for a minute, 2. Then he stood up, wiped his face, and began the restoration. The earth's memory kicked in. Where Daniel had already built, the restoration proceeded quickly. The trails returned in a day, the cascades in 2, the terraces in 3. Not all of them. The bottom 2 had to be rebuilt because the storm had washed away not only the soil, but also the foundation. But the top 4 were back up. The soil had compacted. The gutters had leveled out. The moss returned overnight. The system remembered every stone Daniel had laid, every angle he had calculated, every word of the specifications he had spoken, and it reproduced them faster than he had built them the first time. 3 times as fast, sometimes 4 times as fast. Daniel worked without stopping. Minsu worked beside him. She didn't ask what to do. She just watched what he was doing and repeated it. She hauled stones, cleaned the bowls, restored the trails. On the 3rd day of restoration, Daniel realized she had memorized the placement of every stone on the trail. Every single one. He asked how. She said a tracker memorizes the path the first time. Otherwise, a tracker is a dead tracker. On the 5th day after the storm, a wind blew in from the south and brought seeds with it. Dozens. Hundreds. They fell from the sky like green snow. Tiny, light, fluffy. They settled on the wet earth of the terraces, on the moss, on the stones, on everything. Attraction. The storm had destroyed part of the island, but the island responded. The healthy earth called out to life. And life came. A week later, the terraces were covered with new sprouts, not just rochai, dozens of unfamiliar plants. Daniel walked among the beds and studied each one. He touched them, sniffed them, tasted them. The system helped. When he touched a plant, a sensation arose in his mind. Not a name, not a description, a sensation. This is edible. This is medicinal. This is poisonous. This is simply beautiful. He sorted them. He uprooted the poisonous ones. He left the edible ones. He transplanted the medicinal ones to a separate area. He let the beautiful ones grow wherever they wanted. After the storm, the island became more diverse, richer, more alive, as if the hurricane had not been a catastrophe, but a reboot. Daniel thought that in ecology, this is called succession. Disruption opens up space for new growth. The storm washed away the old, but the soil he had created was healthy, and healthy soil recovers, always. He didn't throw away the dead tree. He cut it into planks. From the planks, he made shelves for the huts. From the bark, he made mulch for the garden. From the roots, he made a frame for a new trellis. Nothing was wasted. Everything was put to use. In its place, he planted a new sapling, a different variety, one of the ones Wren had brought from his brother-in-law. Daniel didn't know what would grow from it, but he trusted his land. The land knew better. G.A. returned a week after the storm. Her ship entered the bay, and G.A. went ashore in boots. Not in silk shoes, in knee-high leather boots. Practical, comfortable. Daniel looked at the boots, then at G.A. She caught his gaze and said that boots were cheaper than new shoes for every visit. Daniel nodded. She brought the first money, silver, a pouch as heavy as a stone. The first batch of moon salt sold out in 2 days. In labeled vials, G.A. So, moon salt, bone needle. The price was 6 times higher than what Wren was getting. Daniel took the pouch, held it in his hand, placed it on a shelf in the hut. Money wasn't the goal. Money was a tool. He needed supplies, seedlings, seeds, livestock, people. G.A. unfolded the list, everything she'd found in the markets of Songhua at his request. Seeds of 10 varieties, 4 seedlings, 2 kids, bags of soil, cloth, ropes, metal tools, and books. Daniel had asked for books, reference books on local botany, on agronomy, on herbalism. He couldn't work with plants he didn't understand. He needed knowledge. Jia found 4 books, worn, old, expensive. Daniel held them as if they were sacred. Jia stayed for 3 days. This time, she wasn't just observing. She was working, arguing, calculating, suggesting. She sat on a rock by the waterfalls with parchment and a brush and wrote down every number. Water volume, salt volume, crystallization time, crystal size depending on temperature. She was building a model, a commercial one, a logistical one. Daniel watched and saw a person doing something for herself for the first time in her life. Not for her father, not for home, for herself. She was on fire. Her eyes sparkled, her cheeks flushed. Her silk was splattered with salt water, and she didn't notice. On the second evening, she came to Daniel on the terrace with the calculations. If production were increased to the current limit, in 6 months' time, moon salt from bone needle would become the most expensive food product in the archipelago. More expensive than mithril dust. More expensive than spiritual herbs, because everyone needs salt. And salt like this is found only here. Daniel listened. He nodded. Then he said he wouldn't increase production to the limit. Jia paused. She asked why. He said because the island isn't a conveyor belt. It has its own rhythm. It has its limits. If you squeeze everything out of it, it will yield more salt now and less a year from now. Depletion, the very problem that is killing islands throughout the archipelago. Jia opened her mouth, closed it, thought, then nodded slowly. She understood. Scarcity drives up the price. Limited production isn't a weakness. It's a strategy. Daniel thought he hadn't meant strategy. He'd meant caring for the land. But if it was easier for Jia to think of it as a strategy, so be it. The result is the same. On the third day before her departure, Jia stood on the shore and looked at the island. She was different. Not the woman who had arrived 2 weeks ago in silks and a mask, boots, a simple shirt over silk, hair pulled back in a ponytail, hands stained with salt. She turned to Daniel and said she would return in 3 weeks with the first large shipment of orders, and that she needed a residence on the island, a permanent one. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. There was something new in her eyes, not business interest, not calculation, something warm and frightened at the same time, like a little animal peeking out of its burrow for the first time. Daniel said he would design it. Jia nodded. She got into the rowboat. She rowed away. Min-soo stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said that the woman would live here. Not a question, a statement. Daniel said it looked that way. Min-soo paused. Then she said she needed a hut farther away from the southern slope. Daniel looked at her. Min-soo was looking at the ocean. Her ears were pink. Daniel thought he should check if there were any insects on the island that made ears turn red. Then he decided there weren't, and that it wasn't about the insects. The 4th month. 3 people lived on the island: Daniel, Min-soo, and the goats. The kids that Jia had brought had grown into 2 stubborn, cheeky, and incredibly useful animals. They ate everything: moss, seaweed, weeds, bark, rochai if you didn't keep an eye on them. Daniel built a pen. The goats escaped from it on the very first day. He built a sturdier pen. The goats escaped on the second day. He built a pen with stone walls a meter high, and the goats stood inside and looked at him with an expression that said, a meter-high wall was nothing but a challenge. Min-soo watched his war with the goats with something resembling amusement. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were different, brighter, more alive. She tied a rope to the goat's legs and drove stakes into the ground. A simple solution, effective. Daniel looked at the stakes and thought he was overcomplicating things. Engineering mindset. Sometimes a rope works better than a wall. The goats gave milk. Not much, but milk. Daniel drank his first mug with his eyes closed. Warm, slightly sweet, thick. After months of roti and fish, the milk was like a feast. He brought the mug to Min-soo. She tasted it, silently. Then she looked at the goat, then at Daniel, and nodded. That was the highest rating on Min-soo's scale. Daniel began to think about cheese. If he had enough milk, if he could find a way to culture it, if he could maintain the right storage temperature, moon salt and moon cheese. He laughed at his own thoughts. Then he grew serious, because it was a good idea. In the 4th week of the 4th month, Ren arrived with news. Bad news. He went ashore and immediately asked for water. He drank for a long time. Then he sat down and told them. The Volcania Empire had sent a cartographic expedition into neutral waters. 3 ships. Officially, they were mapping ocean currents. Unofficially, everyone knows why. They're searching for resources in no man's land. Every island, every rock, every atoll. Bone Needle lies in their path. Ren pointed it out on the map. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, maybe sooner if the wind's favorable. Daniel looked at the map and did the math. 3 ships, cartographers. But Ren said there were battle mages among the cartographers. 3 of them, disguised as scientists. Ren knew because his cousin served in the Sanhua Port Guard and saw them loading up. Not nerds, soldiers in plain clothes. Daniel looked up at Min-soo. Min-soo was already on her feet. Her face was stony. Her hands were relaxed, but her eyes were burning. She was in her element. She asked how many people were on each ship. Ren said between 20 and 30. Min-soo nodded. She counted aloud. 60 to 90 people. 3 mages against 1 landscape architect and 1 former hunter. The odds were not in their favor. Daniel thought for 3 days. He didn't sleep those 3 nights. He walked around the island. He touched the stones. He listened to the earth. He counted. He estimated. He rejected. He started over. On the 4th day, he called Minsu and Ren to the garden. He sat down on a rock and said he wouldn't fight. Minsu looked at him. Ren looked at him. Both were waiting for an explanation. Daniel explained. If he turned the island into a fortress, the island would cease to be a home. It would become a weapon, and weapons attract war. The stronger the walls, the larger the army they would send to break them down. He couldn't defeat the empire, not one of the 4. He had no army, no fleet, no mages. He has water, salt, a garden, and a principle. Land that is useful while alive is worth more than land that is useful when dead. Ren listened and nodded slowly. Minsu listened and didn't nod. She said that pretty words wouldn't stop a battle mage. Daniel agreed. That's why he has a plan. Not a military one, a landscaping one. For the next week, Daniel reshaped the island. Not for beauty, for survival, but survival on his terms. He started with the cove, the only place where a ship could dock. He studied the seabed, waded waist-deep in the water for hours, felt the rocks, measured the depth. And then he designed it, an underwater labyrinth. Stone ridges on the bay floor, positioned so that a ship with a draft of more than a meter couldn't enter without knowing the channel. A natural element, nothing artificial. Just rocks on the bottom that had always been there. Only now they were a little higher, a little closer together. The system responded. The rocks on the bottom shifted. Slowly, over days, but they shifted. The channel became narrow and winding. Ren tested it on his schooner. He said a warship wouldn't fit. Too big, too deep a draft. They'd have to land in rowboats. And rowboats hold a maximum of 10 to 15 people at a time, not 60. Daniel nodded. The first layer. The second layer. Fog. The island had always been in a foggy zone. Daniel figured out why. Warm rock, cold water, temperature difference, condensation. He amplified the effect. He built a series of stone pyramids on the northern shore. Dark basalt heated up in the sun. At night, it gave off heat. The temperature difference increased. The fog grew thicker, denser, more persistent. A ship approaching the island would lose sight of it within half a mile. Navigating in the fog without knowledge of the local waters is suicide. The third layer, the trails. Daniel rebuilt all the trails on the island. Now they didn't run straight, but in loops. Turn after turn, fork after fork. To someone who knew the island, the trails were clear. To a stranger, it was a maze. Every turn looked the same. Every fork led to the next fork. After an hour's walk, a stranger would find themselves back at the start, or on the shore, or at the cliff's edge, but not where he wanted to be. Minsu tested the paths. She walked the entire labyrinth with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and said that to her, the paths were transparent. She knew every stone, but a stranger would get lost, guaranteed. The fourth layer was the thinnest. A visitor to the island, Daniel didn't fully understand how it worked, but he sensed it. The island reacted to intentions. When Ren came with good intentions, the paths were smooth, the stones were dry, the path was short. When Daniel imagined a person with hostile intentions, something changed. The air thickened, the stones became slippery, distances stretched out. He couldn't control it, the island did it on its own. But he could amplify the effect. The healthier the ecosystem, the more keenly the island sensed strangers. The more life there was on the rock, the more precisely the island could distinguish who came in peace and who did not. That's why Daniel didn't build walls. He planted trees. Every new plant, every bush, every flower isn't just decoration. It's a sensor, a living security system. Minsu listened to his explanation. She was silent for a long time. Then she said it was the strangest defense doctrine she had ever heard in her life. Daniel said he wasn't a general. He was a gardener. Minsu looked at him, and for the first time since she'd been on the island, her lips curved. Not a smile, a shadow of a smile, a hint. But Daniel saw it, and something inside him tightened. Warmth. Brief. He turned away and went to plant a tree. He didn't have time for such things. He had the Vulcan mages in 2 weeks. Zia returned a day before the Vulcanians' expected arrival. She brought news from Songhua. The trading houses knew about the Vulcanian expedition, and they were unhappy. The bone needle stood in neutral waters. If Vulcania established control over it, it would upset the balance. Songhua could not intervene openly. But Jia did not arrive empty-handed. She brought a document, an official trading license from the So Trading House for bone needles products, certified by the Songhua Imperial Seal. This meant that an attack on the island was an attack on Songhua's trading interests, not on the empire, on the trading house. But the So Trading House was the 4th largest in the empire, and it had friends. Daniel took the document. He read it. He looked at Jia. She stood before him with pride in her eyes. She had done this, all by herself, without her brothers, without her father. She had gathered the documents, negotiated with the officials, obtained the seal in 3 weeks. Daniel said she was amazing. Jia blinked. Her mask wavered. She quickly turned away and said it was just business. Her voice was slightly higher than usual. The Vulcans arrived at dawn. 3 ships emerged from the morning mist like dark beasts. Gray sails, steel hulls, military ships disguised as research vessels. Daniel stood on the southern ridge and counted. 3 ships, about 80 people. A man in a dark cloak stood at the bow of the lead ship. Even from that distance, Daniel sensed something about him. Pressure, as if the air around that man were heavier. The ships approached the bay and stopped. The first one tried to enter. The keel scraped against the rock. The ship stopped. It tried another course. Rock again. Daniel saw the commotion on deck. Sailors with poles were measuring the depth. There was no depth. Rocks everywhere. The underwater labyrinth was working. The ships moved away and dropped anchor half a mile from the shore. They lowered the rowboats. Daniel counted 4. 6 or 7 men in each. 25, not 80. The first layer of defense had worked. The rowboats entered the fog. Daniel heard voices, muffled, confused. The fog was thick as milk. Oars splashed. Voices called out to one another. One boat passed the cove and headed north. The second ran aground on the rocks on the eastern shore. There was nowhere to dock there. The third and fourth found the cove. 14 people stepped onto the rocks. Minso was counting from the northern cliff. Daniel stood on the shore, alone, with empty hands, unarmed. Behind him, the terraces were green. It smelled of moss and salt. The first to step ashore was an officer, young, fair-haired, with a stern face and cold eyes. Behind him, soldiers, 6 of them, in light armor, armed. Then 3 in civilian clothes. One of them was the One, in a dark coat, with a heavy atmosphere. The rest carried boxes and instruments, cartographers, real ones, as a cover. The officer approached Daniel, introduced himself. Captain Arnold D. Crane, 3rd Cartographic Corps of Vulcania. Official mission: mapping neutral waters, requesting permission to survey the island. His voice was polite. His eyes were not. Daniel looked at him, then at the armed soldiers, then at the mage in the cloak, then back at the captain, and said he was glad to have guests, that the island was open for inspection. But there were rules. Weapons must remain on shore. Captain Crane raised an eyebrow. He said that was impossible. Standard security procedure. Daniel nodded. He said he understood, and that the weapons would remain on shore, because on his island, no one threatened anyone, and no one needs protection. Crane looked at him for 5 seconds. Then he glanced back at the mage in the cloak. The mage stood motionless, his face hidden by a hood. Crane turned to Daniel and said they would leave their weapons behind. The soldiers laid their swords on the rocks, reluctantly, with the look of people who were sure it wouldn't be for long. Daniel led them across the island, along his own paths, following his own route. He showed them what he wanted to show: waterfalls, terraces, the garden. He explained, not everything, but enough: the principle of desalination, terracing methods, the irrigation system. The cartographers took notes. They drew. They measured. They were real scientists, interested, surprised. One of them, an old man with a white beard, crouched down by the cascade and studied the condenser moss for a long time. Then he looked at Daniel with an expression Daniel recognized: professional admiration. He asked how Daniel had achieved such a rapid colonization of the moss. Daniel said he hadn't achieved it. The moss had come on its own. The old man looked at the moss, then at Daniel, then at the moss, and said nothing. But there was a thought in his eyes, and the thought was correct. The mage in the cloak walked last. He didn't look at the cascades, didn't look at the terraces. He looked at the stones, at the path, at the air. Daniel felt his attention like a touch, heavy, scrutinizing. The mage touched the stones, sniffed the moss. Once he stopped and placed his palm on the ground. He closed his eyes. He stood like that for 30 seconds. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Daniel. From under the hood, gray eyes looked at Daniel. Old, intelligent, dangerous. The mage removed his hood. His face was not young, 60 years old, maybe older. A short gray beard, a scar across his left eyebrow. He introduced himself. Corvin Wald, Archmage of the Northern Circle of Volcania, historian, explorer. He said he was pleased to meet him. His voice was soft, warm. It was more terrifying than any weapon. Wald asked to speak in private. Daniel agreed. They sat in the garden. 3 trees, young, green. A 4th had just been planted. Wald looked at the trees, then at the ground beneath them, then at Daniel, and said he knew. Daniel waited. Wald continued. He said he had been studying ancient chronicles for 20 years, that he had found references to a sunken continent, to a system created by its masters, to a key they had left behind. Daniel listened, his expression unchanged. Wald spoke calmly, no threats, no pressure, like a scientist who had finally found proof of his theory. He said that Bone Needle Island wasn't an island, it was a peak, the last fragment of a world that had sunk beneath the waves 1,000 years ago. And the system that responded to Daniel wasn't a gift, it was a mechanism, a sentinel, a lock. Daniel was silent. Wald looked at him and said that Daniel was no ordinary man, that the system had chosen him, and that the power sleeping beneath this island was capable of changing the entire archipelago. Daniel remained silent for another 10 seconds. Then he asked one thing. He asked what Wald wanted. Wald smiled, gently, sadly. He said he wanted to understand. He had spent 20 years of his life on this mystery. He hadn't come to take, he had come to see. Daniel looked him in the eyes. He searched for a lie. He didn't find one. That didn't mean there wasn't one. It meant that Wald knew how to hide it. The Vulcans stayed on the island for 2 days. Captain Crane was irritated. His tracks were confusing. His measurements didn't match up. Distances were shifting. The compass was lying. Crane was angry, quietly and professionally. The soldiers were nervous. They sensed what Daniel had imbued the island with: sticky resistance, uncertainty, a feeling that the land didn't want them there. One soldier stumbled on level ground 3 times in a row. Another got lost on the trail between the cove and the waterfall, a distance of 100 meters. He walked for half an hour. Crane reported to Wald that the island was anomalous. Wald nodded. He already knew. On the second evening, Wald came to Daniel again. He sat down next to him by the fire. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. He said that Daniel was doing a great thing, but he was doing it like a child playing with matches in a powder magazine. The power beneath the island is immense, ancient, dangerous. The previous masters used it for war and drowned an entire continent. Daniel plants trees and makes salt. That is wonderful. But what will happen when the 4 empires decide that trees and salt are not enough reason to leave this power in the hands of a single man? Daniel listened. Wald was not threatening. He was warning. And that was the difference. Daniel replied. He said he understood. That he didn't control what lay beneath the island. That he wasn't trying to. That he was doing the only thing he knew how to do: building, planting, healing the earth. If that wasn't enough, if the world decides that a gardener has no right to his garden, then the world will come and take it. But it will have to explain why the apple trees must die. Wald looked at him for a long time. Then he said quietly that Daniel was either a very wise man or a very naive one. Daniel said that usually it was one and the same. Wald didn't smile, but something in his face changed. He stood up, said goodbye, went to the rowboat. In the morning, the Vulcans' ships left, all 3 of them, without incident, without a capture, no ultimatum. Daniel stood on the shore and watched the gray sails disappear into the fog. Minsu stood beside him. Jia stood beside him. Both were silent. Daniel said this wasn't the end. Minsu said she knew. Jia said Wald would return. Daniel nodded. Wald would return. But next time, Daniel would be better prepared. He looked at his island, at the green terraces, at the garden, at the huts, at the waterfalls. A small world. His world. He turned and went to work. The compost wouldn't turn itself. After the Vulcans left, the island fell silent. Daniel stood at the edge of the southern terrace and looked out at the ocean. An empty horizon. No sails, no ships, only water and sky. He stood there for 10 minutes. Then he sat down on the ground. He rested his hands on his knees, and for the first time in 4 months, he allowed himself to feel the weariness. Not physical, deeper. The weariness of a man who builds every day and waits every day for them to come and take it away. He sat and breathed. The earth beneath him was warm, soft, alive. His earth. He closed his eyes and heard the island, the murmur of water in the cascades, the rustle of moss in the wind, the cries of seagulls, the clucking of hens, the bleating of a goat, the quiet scrape of a knife against stone. Minsu was sharpening her blade. Every sound was familiar. Every one was right. He opened his eyes. He looked at his hands. Calluses, scars, dirt. Hands that had built everything he saw around him. He stood up and went to work. The fatigue hadn't gone anywhere, but it could wait. The 5th month brought changes. Wren brought people. Not merchants, not soldiers. People. 4 of them. A man and a woman with 2 children. A boy of about 10 and a girl of 7. Fishermen from the eastern archipelago. Their island had been flooded, not by a storm, by a slow rise in the water. The process had taken years. First the low-lying fields disappeared, then the wells turned salty, then the houses. They had lived on a boat for 3 months. Wren picked them up on the open sea. The man stood on the shore of Bone Needle and looked at the land, at real land, under his feet, green, warm. His face was blank, not out of indifference, because all emotion had ended 3 months ago. The woman held the children by the hands. The girl looked at the goat. The boy looked at the waterfall, with his mouth open. Daniel looked at them. 2 voices inside him clashed. The first said he didn't have enough resources for 4 people, that there was barely enough food, that space was limited, that every extra mouth was a drain on resources. The second voice showed him the face of the girl looking at the goat. Daniel sighed. He turned to the man. He asked if the man knew how to fish. The man looked at him. For the first time in a long while, something flashed in his eyes. He said he was a 4th-generation fisherman. Daniel nodded. He said that then they had something to talk about. The family stayed. The man's name was Hiro. His wife was Setsu. Their children were Tamo and Lin. Daniel put them up in the guest hut. Chia would be unhappy on her next visit. But that was for later. Right now, he had 6 people on the island, and he had to feed them all. Hiro turned out to be an incredible fisherman. He knew the sea as well as Daniel knew the land. On the very first day, he caught enough fish to last 2 days. On the second day, he found a spot off the eastern shore where the current brought in schools of fish every morning. On the third day, he began building a trap, a woven basket made of twigs and ropes. Simple, effective. The fish went in and couldn't get out. Daniel watched and learned. Hiro did for the sea what Daniel did for the land. He turned chaos into order. They understood each other without words. 2 masters, different elements, one logic. Setsu took charge of the kitchen. She cooked with what was available. Fish, rocha, goat's milk, eggs, seaweed. Her hands transformed the meager ingredients into food that made you want to live. For the first time in 4 months, Daniel ate something other than boiled fish and raw greens. He nearly cried over a bowl of fish soup with herbs. Tamal and Lin ran around the island, the first children on Bone Needle. Their laughter rang between the rocks, and the echo carried it across the entire southern slope. Minsu heard that laughter, and something in her stony face cracked. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter. But it cracked. Daniel was building, not alone anymore. Hiro helped with the heavy work, stones, logs, structures. Together, they worked 4 times faster than Daniel alone. The 7th terrace, the 8th, the 9th. The southern slope was green with a solid carpet of vegetation. The moss had spread to the western bank. Flowers had reached the summit. The garden had grown wild. The trees stretched higher than their heads. The first buds appeared on the oldest tree. Daniel looked at them every morning. He waited. Soon, in a month or 2, the first fruits. The island was changing not only on the outside, it was changing on the inside. Daniel could feel it through the system. The layers beneath the surface were coming to life. The water tables were rising. New springs were breaking through to the surface. One on the western slope. Fresh. A real freshwater spring. Not from a waterfall, from the ground. Daniel stood over it and couldn't believe it. Then he believed it. Then he built a stone basin around it. He recited the specifications: depth, volume, drainage, protection against contamination. By morning, the pool was full of clean water, the second spring on the island. But this one was real, born of the earth that had come to life. Lynn found flowers, a little girl who had lived on a boat for 3 months and seen nothing but water. She found a clearing with blue flowers on the western slope. Daniel heard a scream and ran, thinking something bad had happened. He found Lynn sitting in the middle of the flowers. She wasn't screaming out of fear. She was screaming with delight. She sat there, touching the petals, each flower in turn, carefully, as if it were something impossible. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing and watched. Then he sat down beside her. Lynn looked at him. She asked why the flowers were blue. Daniel said he didn't know, that they had grown on their own, that the island had grown them. Lynn thought for a moment. Then she asked if the island could grow red ones. Daniel said he'd try. Lynn nodded, seriously, like someone who had just placed an important order. Daniel returned to the terrace and thought that for this moment alone, it had been worth transporting himself to a foreign world, for the face of a 7-year-old girl touching flowers. Returned a week later. She saw the hero family. She saw that the guest hut was occupied. She saw children running across the terraces. Her face went through 3 stages: irritation, calculation, acceptance. 3 seconds. Then she turned to Daniel and said she needed her own hut, immediately. Daniel said he was already designing it. Jia looked at him, then at Lynn, who was running toward her with a bunch of blue flowers in her hand. Lynn held out the flowers. Jia looked at the flowers, at the child, at the dirty little fingers. Something in her face broke. Quietly. Imperceptibly. She took the flowers. She said thank you. Her voice wasn't businesslike. It was human. Lynn ran off. Jia stood with the blue flowers in her hands and watched her go. Daniel saw how Jia's fingers clenched the stems, tightly, as if she were afraid they would be taken away. He turned away, gave her time. Jia, 22 years old, a business genius and heiress to a great house, stood on a dirty island in the middle of the ocean with a bunch of wildflowers, unable to remember the last time she'd been given something just like that. It took 5 days to build Jia's residence. Daniel wasn't building a hut. He was building a house for a specific person with a clear understanding of who would live in it. 4 by 5 meters. Stone walls finished with smooth stone. 2 windows. A large one facing south with a view of the ocean. A small one facing east with a view of the garden. Inside, a desk made of flat stone slabs. Shelves for documents. A niche for clothes. A bed wider than in other huts. The floor was made of polished stone, covered with moss only in the sleeping area. The work area was clean, dry, suitable for paper and ink. He had added a small detail, a stone shelf by the window. On it stood a bowl of moon salt, and a small glass vial in which he had placed 3 blue flowers. When Jia entered, she walked around the room. She ran her fingers over the table, over the shelves, over the walls. She stopped by the window. She saw the bowl of salt. She saw the flowers. She was silent for a long time. Then she turned to Daniel. Her eyes were shining. She said the table was the perfect height. Daniel said he had measured the length of her forearm when she was signing the contract and calculated the ergonomics. Jia looked at him. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she said quickly and quietly that he was an impossible person. And she left. Quickly. Daniel remained standing in the empty house and thought that perhaps he had gone overboard with the flowers. The 6th month. 8 people lived on the island. Daniel, Minsu, Jia, Hero, Setsu, Tamo, Lin, and an old man named Gang who had sailed in alone on a wrecked boat. A former healer from Lumera, exiled for treating patients whom the temple had declared cursed. He arrived with nothing, skin and bones. Daniel fed him, gave him water, gave him a place to stay. In return, Gen examined every inhabitant of the island. He made diagnoses. He prescribed treatment. He told Daniel that he was suffering from exhaustion and sleep deprivation, and that if he didn't start sleeping 7 hours a day within 3 months, his body would give out. Daniel wanted to object. Minsu stood next again, with her arms crossed, with a face that brooked no argument. Daniel looked at them. 2 people, a healer and a hunter, united by a common goal, to make him sleep. He gave in. 7 hours, starting today. Gen began working with the medicinal plants that Daniel had transplanted to a separate area. The old man knew each one by name, knew their properties, knew the dosage, knew the combinations. To Daniel, they were just plants that felt medicinal. To Gan, it was a pharmacy. In a week, he compiled a list of 32 species, 11 medicinal, 7 culinary, 4 cosmetic, 3 poisonous, 7 useless. Daniel looked at the list and saw the future. Not just moon salt, medicinal herbs, healing infusions, ointments. If Jia could sell them the same way she sells salt. He showed the list to Jia. She read it. Her eyes did what they always did. They calculated. Left column, right column, internal accounting. Then she looked up and said that 4 of these herbs were on Lumera's list of strategic resources. Their export was prohibited. Their price on the black market was astronomical. And on bone needle, they grew on their own. She fell silent. Then she said quietly that if Lumera found out, they wouldn't send an embassy. They'd send an army. Daniel looked at the list, at the herbs, at his island, which had been too generous for its own good. Every gift from the earth is a new threat. Every resource is a new enemy. He stood on the terrace and counted. Lunar salt had attracted Sankva. The anomaly had attracted Volcania. The herbs would attract Lumera. That left the black tide. Pirates. They don't need a reason. They need loot. Daniel looked at the horizon. 4 empires, 4 threats. 1 island, 1 gardener. He turned to Jia, said he needed more people. Not laborers, not soldiers. People. Those who need a home. Those who would defend the island not because they were ordered to, but because it was their home. Jia nodded. She said she knew where to look. The ports of Songhua were full of refugees, people without land, without a home, without hope. Daniel said she should choose them, by name, not just anyone, those with hands and a willingness to work, those with nowhere else to go, those ready to build, not just to live. Jia looked at him and said it sounded like army recruitment. Daniel said it was recruitment for a family. Jia blinked. Then she turned away. Then she said she was sailing away tomorrow morning. Her voice was hoarse. Daniel didn't ask why. After the Vulcans left, the first family of refugees arrived on the island with their children, and the old healer Gang bringing the population to 8. The island's medicinal plants turned out to be strategic resources, creating a new threat from Lumer. Daniel asked Jia to look for new residents in the ports of Songhua, preparing for the inevitable clash with all 4 empires. The 7th month. 23 people lived on the island. Jia brought 15, by name, just as he had asked. A blacksmith from the eastern port of Songhua who had lost his workshop in a flood. 2 sisters, weavers from the Lumerian borderlands who had fled temple service. A carpenter with his wife and daughter. 3 sailors from different ports, discharged ashore for offenses that were not really offenses. An old potter. A herbalist. a 14-year-old orphan boy with hands that could do anything, and Captain Una Pack. Una Pack arrived separately, on her own schooner, shabby, patched up, but her own. She had 10 people with her, former sailors of the San Juan patrol fleet, all stripped of their ranks, all for the same reason: refusal to carry out orders they could not carry out while remaining human. Una stood on the shore of Bone Needle, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face and a voice accustomed to shouting over the storm. She looked at the island, at the terraces, at the huts, at the people who had come out to meet them, at Daniel. She said she'd been told about this place, that she hadn't believed it, that she'd come to see for herself. Daniel asked what she saw. Una looked again, slowly, carefully, like someone used to assessing ports who knows the difference between a harbor and a trap. Then she said she saw a place worth defending. Daniel nodded. He said that then she needed to see the cove, because he needed a port. And he needed a captain. Una walked around the cove in 2 hours. She measured the depth with a sounding line. She checked the currents. She studied the shore. Then she returned to Daniel and began to speak. Quickly, precisely, professionally. She needed a pier, here, on the southern side of the bay, where the rock juts out into the water like a natural pier. We need a breakwater to protect against the southwest swell. We need a warehouse on the shore. We need a lighthouse, or at least a fire on the northern cliff for night navigation. Daniel listened and saw. Not a dock, a port, a harbor, a place where ships come. Not a military base, not a commercial terminal, a harbor for those who have nowhere else to go. He said he would design it. Una said she wanted to participate. Daniel nodded. They began that very evening. They sat by the fire and sketched. Una knew the sea. Daniel knew the land. Together, they need a place where the sea and the land meet. A pier, 4 mooring points, a semicircular stone breakwater, a warehouse, a canopy, and a staircase from the water to the shore. Wide, comfortable, so that a person stepping from the sea onto land would feel they were stepping not onto stone, but into a home. Daniel named each pier, not by number, by name. The pier of quiet return, the pier of the first morning, the pier of the salty wind, the pier of last hope. Una read the names, silently. Her face was motionless, but the hands holding the drawing trembled. She set the parchment aside, stood up, went ashore, stood with her back to him for about 5 minutes. Then she returned. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. She said that the pier of last hope should be closer to the stairs, so it would be visible right away. Daniel moved it. Una nodded. They worked until dawn. The construction of the port took 3 weeks. Daniel designed. Una supervised. The sailors worked. The carpenter laid the wooden decking. The blacksmith forged the fasteners. Everyone else hauled stones. 23 people. 23 pairs of hands. The island hummed with activity. For the first time, Daniel saw his project come to life, not through his own hands, but through the hands of others. It was a strange feeling. He drew the plans, he gave the specifications, and the stones fell into place. Not because the system moved them, because people moved them according to his blueprint. The system helped. The stone was more obedient. The water receded at the right moments. The weather stayed sunny for 3 weeks straight. But the main work was done by hands. Human hands. Many hands. And that was right. Daniel realized something important. The system amplifies him, but people multiply him. 1 person with the system can build a garden. 23 people with the system can build a world. The port was ready by the start of the 8th month. 4 docks, a stone pier, a warehouse, a staircase, and a small lighthouse on the northern cliff. Not a tower, a stone bowl with oil and a wick. Minsu lit it every evening. She volunteered herself. No one asked her to. She would climb the northern cliff at dusk and light the fire. Every evening, without exception. Daniel asked why. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that when she was swimming toward the island on a piece of driftwood in the dark, she thought that if there were a fire burning somewhere, she would know where to swim. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stood there and watched the fire. Then he said quietly that the lighthouse would burn every night. Is why the island stands. Minsu looked at him. Her hand lay on the rock next to his. The distance between their fingers was a palm's width. Neither of them moved, but both knew that the distance had grown smaller, a little, the width of a breath. Lumera sent an embassy in the 9th month. Not soldiers, priests. 5 men in white robes bearing the golden symbols of the goddess. They arrived on a beautiful ship with scarlet sails. They anchored in the roadstead. They lowered a rowboat. They went ashore. The chief priest was tall and thin. His face was like that of a bird of prey. His eyes were like 2 pieces of ice. He looked at the island, at the green terraces, at the waterfalls, at the harbor, at the people, and he declared that the island of Bone Needle was a manifest miracle of the goddess Lumera, that all living things on it belonged to the temple, and that the owner was obliged to transfer the island to the custody of the priestly council immediately. Daniel stood before him. Yuna stood beside him. Behind her were 10 sailors. Behind them were the rest of the inhabitants, 23 people. Daniel looked at the priest, and he replied, just as he had replied to clients who came to the site and demanded that everything be redone. Politely, calmly, and absolutely unyieldingly. He said that he thanked the goddess for her attention, that he considered the island a miracle too, but not the goddess, the compost, and proper drainage, and that he had no intention of passing it on. The priest looked at him. His expression didn't change. He said it wasn't a request. It was the goddess's will. Daniel said the goddess's will didn't include a schedule for fertilizing fruit trees. So if the goddess wanted the island, she should study agronomy first. The priests stood on the shore for 3 hours. They tried to go deeper into the island. The paths wouldn't let them. Every turn led back to the shore. The rocks were slippery. The air was thick. One young priest tried to use something, magic, or a prayer. He raised his hands and began to speak in a chanting voice. The ground beneath his feet grew soft. He sank up to his ankles. He fell silent. He pulled his legs out. He fell completely silent. The senior priest watched this with the face of a man who, for the first time in his life, had encountered a door that would not open at his command. He turned to Daniel. He said that the temple would remember, that the island would be declared heretical, that no believer in Lumera would set foot on this land of their own free will. Daniel said that was a shame.